How are you, class? This is Stephen Pliaconis back with you again. We finally made it. We're at the end of our unit plans. Right now we're on my home page, 1920s with ply.weebly.com. Right now I'm going to take you through my home page. Right now my unit plan is centered around the 1920s and U.S. history. The title of my unit is the Roaring Twenties, pretty much the standard slang for the decade of the time. You can see right at the start, my teacher's page is visible right at the front of the page at the top. Make it clear it's for 11th graders. That's when you take your U.S. history course in high school. Once again, I detail it out. It's not just the 20s, it's the 1920s and U.S. history. My unit summary, just to basically put it all in a couple sentences, is World War I happened and it kind of boomed our economy, but it also left the rest of the world in shambles. We stepped up as a country with influence in politics. It was a crazy time for us because, women were stepping up. They were starting to have a voice in our country, and a couple things passed were prohibition and women's suffrage. Obviously, prohibition was reneged a few years later, but women's suffrage was a huge monumental event for our country. And at the same time, you had Jim Crow laws. So it's just like one and the other, night and day. It's a pretty insane decade when you think about it, as far as social movements go. It doesn't get enough credit. And the big ideas and unit goals basically hits at all the major events. The essential question is, did the 1920s signal a change in ideals within the U.S.? And all of these goals, the big ideas, will basically address that question and will show why it was a major decade in our country and something that shouldn't be just looked over in between World War I and World War II. So you can see it's the presidencies, the Back to Africa movement, and all the civil right movements at the time, 18th and 19th Amendments, the Harlem Renaissance that most of us are familiar hearing about with jazz and authors like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston. And then also, most people don't remember about the 1920s as mass production, the assembly line, Ford, the big things that step out. And then finally, the content standard is basically summarizing the political, social movements, technological movements that were addressing the big ideas of the 1920s, and then the SLOs, student learning objectives, analyze a series of websites to identify why the 18th Amendment was passed and why did it fail, and how are we dealing with the effects still today. And the second one being, during a reading, my students will examine and note the policies, some of the scandals of Warren G. Harding, the events of Calvin Coolidge, Harding's death, Herbert Hoover getting the blame for the start of the Great Depression in 1929, and then finally examine Zora Neale Hurston's how it feels to be colored me, correlate that with African American struggles, the Great Migration, and how the formation of the Harlem Renaissance all tied into one, into a critical thinking essay, primary source essay, I should say. Moving on, I want to get into my unit resources page. Just want to give everybody a brief overview. Once people see my student learning objective number 3, this will make sense as how it feels to be colored me. That's the main part of it, is to examine that source. You could click it, it'll take you to the website, for example, and boom, and it has the actual source, which is great for my students, just the way it was written. Coming back to my page, you'll see that there's a bunch of different videos. There's a lot of good videos out there for the 1920s that a lot of websites can't really hit home. Specifically, mass production and advertising. A lot of people neglect advertising. It was, back then it was just the radio and not television, but, you think of Mad Men in the 50s and you think of, these crazy ways that they were targeting consumers, and it all started in 1920s with the Ford movement and the Model T, and without that, who knows where advertising would be nowadays. And then, of course, you have your interactive websites with the 18th and 19th Amendment. Those will take you to the actual amendments, when they were founded, or when they were composed, I should say, and passed. Then you have some more videos, Roaring Twenties, Live in 1920s, just general cultural things about the 1920s, and one of my favorites being the Harlem Renaissance music playlist. I'm going to open that up for a quick minute. And then right at the start you have Duke Ellington. You have other big time songs at the time that this one gentleman put together for U.S. history students, in particular in Harlem Renaissance. And you'll see all these were big time songs coming out of the time period. The next couple interactive resources I have is Calvin Coolidge and Hoover, some of their politics and Hoover's, or politics and economic policies. For Calvin Coolidge and Hoover, the last two presidents of the decade, and how they differed, but they were both Republicans, conservatives, and it kind of just shows how the Great Depression happened. A lot of it was basically taking a step back for big business, and that kind of burned us later on. And you'll see with the stock market crash of 1929. I love this hyperhistory timeline. You could go in, and not only is it great for any sort of history, but if you look at the Great Depression all the way up to the crisis of 2008, right at the start of it, you could even go into people, for example, and get into different periods leading up to our decade. And you can see, you can click USA, go into 1900, and you'll find most of our people right before Roosevelt. And to go back, okay, and the last one is immigration. A lot of people don't know is the Great Migration was an internal migration and not, an influx of people coming into New York, Ellis Island. It's definitely not that, but the immigration actually was a little bit stagnant during this period. They weren't allowing a lot of Eastern Euros after the war, or not Eastern Euros, but, Germans, etc., right after World War I. And this explains all the quotas and etc. Moving on to my assessments. Okay, my entry level one is a standard survey. I wanted to get a kind of grasp of my students' understanding of the decade. I know when most of us think of 1920s, two things pop up in our head. One, Great Gatsby. Anybody that has watched the movie, the current one, or probably everybody watched the one in high school, the older book version, and most people will point out Leo DiCaprio, and his portrayal of the Great Gatsby and the style and the excess of the 1920s. And then the second being, either the start of the Great Depression, or people assume the Great Depression happened in the 1920s. People don't understand there was just so many different things that happened that were much more important than just the stock market crash and the Great Gatsby. So the survey, I'm going to scroll down real quick. It's right here. It's a Google form. It's great. I constructed a few different questions, multiple choice and short answer, just to kind of get a consensus going. Some of them are more challenging, like this one. Most people wouldn't understand the Great Migration. But, some of them are easy as far as, which model Ford releases. Obviously not Mustang. It'd be the Model T. And then you have the short answer, like most people don't know what the 18th Amendment are, or the 19th Amendment, which is one of the most important amendments. I guess you can't really point out a specific one being the most important, but this is a huge monumental thing that, women didn't have the right to vote, and 19th Amendment coming together in the 1920s was so big for civil rights movements at the time. And then there's some other easy ones, and probably finishing off with a toughie. Coming back, we're going on the formative assessments. You have your Weber size. I did a concept map, my graphic organizer, which I'll take you through in a couple minutes. Critical thinking questions and a timeline. I'm just going to highlight those real quick, these last two specifically. The timeline, or I should say, the critical thinking questions, there's right the last two sentences. which is what I wanted to hit. Okay, right here. The third assessment will be critical thinking questions that assess the domestic events and that affect the civil liberties of African Americans, women, and you know, you have the Ku Klux Klan and some other organizations back to African movement. And I just wanted to throw out some deep-seated questions for my students after they read the text and actually plugged their minds a little bit as far as what it was really like to live through these horrific events. And now you see the all lives, Black Lives Matter, the Donald Trump banning of Muslims, and how that all correlates to back even to the 1920s. You know, it goes all the way back. This whole disparate between races and cultures in our country. And then the last one's a timeline. And I think that's critical for history students, is to understand the series of events. Like I said, most people think that Great Depression happened during the 20s. And that's really not that true. So this one I did mass production, the creation of Ford Model T, kind of put it on the economy side of things, and that will highlight the stock market crash as well. So it actually will cover 3 different standards as far as mass production, being the 0.6, this is 0.7 with Ford, and 0.8 with the Great Depression, the stock market crash. The last one, summative assessments. I have 2. I have an exam and an essay. Exam, standard 50 question multiple choice. Students are going to have to know some dates, some names, just to make sure they understand the basic part of it, as well as the big ideas, summarizing all the assessments and the textbook. The last one would be the big primary source essay. It's a 3-page essay, and I'm going to take you down to the summative essay part. The essay prompt is, what does it mean to be colored in the United States today? How does our history teach us about the future? So the primary source is Zora Neale Hurston. How does it feel to be colored me? So you basically take her thoughts of being colored in 1920s, relate it to the problems we see today, like Black Lives Matter, and then you see the how does history teach us about the future, and that can all be tied in very easily with this one source, which I love, and the background information will all come through our assessments before with lectures and a couple of the other assessments I didn't really highlight in detail. Moving on to my lesson plans. My teacher lecture is pretty cool. I basically summarized all my different objectives, big ideas into one PowerPoint, hit all 11. And then I have my guided notes, which is great for students that struggle with what are the big ideas in my PowerPoint. And it doesn't really do the work for them. It actually makes them work for it. At the same time, there's some extra questions on top of it to make them think even further. That'll help them grasp going into the real assessments, which I'm going to head into my Weber size. Weber size is on prohibition. I found a bunch of great educational websites. This one, my favorite, being the cartoons. I'm going to open that one up for you guys. And you can see there's 21 different cartoons. And they're really not that difficult to understand because like you could see the different anti-saloon league, presidents. You know, you could easily identify these people. And it's not too difficult at the same time. Coming back, I've summarized it with my favorite part is the unintended consequences of prohibition, like forming of mobs, which are now led to gangs, and this whole underground black market. That all started with alcohol. And moving on to my graphic organizer, my concept map, I did a poplet exercise where the students read the textbook and then they head into watching these videos of each president, and then they can make a poplet. And I did one already. That's really all I have for everybody. I want to thank you for watching my video. Thank you for taking this class. I appreciate the teachers. Thank you.